Hello. I can't think of a better session to start off this afternoon with. It is called The Secret Lives of Cities, and it's called that because we are going to be investigating the so-called shadow economy. So I want to start out this conversation by kind of defining that. What are we terming the shadow economy? Who is a part of it? What type of work are they doing? Jen, I want you to start.
Sure. Well, I think a lot about the women that I work with. I work with women who work in our homes as nannies, taking care of our kids, as housekeepers who clean, as home care workers who take care of the elderly and support our loved ones with disabilities. Millions of women who work behind closed doors, and you could go into any apartment building, any neighborhood, and not know which of those homes are also workplaces, because there's no registry, there's no list anywhere. It's all hidden, and it powers everything, right? We often ask our workforce, when we're in a room together, imagine Washington, D.C., if all the domestic workers decided not to go to work one day. What would happen? What would that feel like? What industries would be affected? It's the work that makes everything else possible, and yet it's hidden, often undervalued or not valued, and incredibly vulnerable in the shadows of our economy. And what's interesting about it is we think about it as in the margins and the shadows, but it's increasingly becoming more and more defining of the future, right? If you think about the conditions that define work in the shadow economy, right? Gig work, piecing it together, non-traditional workplaces without access to a safety net or benefits, without consistency of hours, right? Or job security. All of those conditions increasingly define more and more of the future of work, right? More and more of the American workforce. So we think about it as shadow, it powers everything, and it could be our future.
Yeah, and you talked about women specifically as being a huge portion of that sector. What other groups are, disproportionately represented in that sector?
It's a lot of workers of color, a lot of immigrant workers, disproportionately women in low-wage service sectors in particular, where there's not a lot of protections. Yeah.
Because I remember when you came forward and said, I am working in America and I am undocumented, and I remember how that just started this massive conversation about what it meant to have to try and navigate this system without the legal protections afforded that Jen just talked about. I'm wondering if you can talk us through what that experience has been like.
Great. And I should just say that as someone who's Filipino, apparently we're really good caretakers. Whenever I meet somebody at the airport, they're like, oh, my nanny is so good. She's Filipina. Great. I'm mentioning this because, so when I got here, when I was 12, when my mom sent me here, I guess their plan, because they couldn't get me here legally, so they smuggled me without me knowing that I was smuggled. But the original plan was to work in the shadow economy. The original plan was I was supposed to just go through high school, and then after high school, not go to college, because this was 2000, so there was no DREAM Act, there was nothing. And then I was supposed to work at the flea market on Berryessa Road in San Jose, in California, where I'm from. And I was supposed to be a janitor. Like, that was the plan. Until I married a US citizen. I married a woman who was a US citizen. And when my grandfather told me that this was the plan, I said, no, I'm not doing that. And that was me trying to so I did something that no one in my family does, which is I decided to be a writer, a journalist, just so I don't have to be, quote unquote, in the shadows, right? And I think as I was thinking about even the name of this panel, I kept thinking of Ralph Ellison, like the Invisible Man, right? So invisible to whom exactly? It's only a shadow economy because systematically we allow that. But I think everybody in this room and people watching know that, the American economy could not survive without this quote unquote shadow economy. It's there and it's in every salad you eat, right? It's in everything that's cheap that you're like, why is that so cheap? Right? So I think even changing the language around that and making sure that we understand that we're actually dealing with not only workers, we're dealing with families, right? Because these workers belong to families.
Yeah. When we were talking backstage, you mentioned the idea of invisible to who or invisible to whom.
Yeah.
Right. And you said that when you were working as a journalist,
Yeah.
you realized that this whole idea that workers are invisible is a little bit laughable because the government knows exactly where they are and tries to extract money from them.
So I was working at the Washington Post, and somehow my social security number, which is invalid, was not caught by the Washington Post. So E-Verify did nothing for that. So I got, I was there, I was working, and then one day, I was living on U Street before it was U Street, before whatever that is now. And I got a piece of mail from the Social Security Administration saying I had paid this much into Social Security. And I'm like, what? So ICE, DHS can't seem to figure out where we are, but the Social Security Administration does. The IRS knows exactly where we are. So we're not invisible to them, so long as they can keep taking the money, right? And so long as people out there think that we're invisible, it's fine, right? And so I think this is a system, and we have allowed it to kind of perpetuate.
Yeah. Ajin, I want to come back to you and talk a little bit about some of the protections that workers are lacking when they do not participate in what is considered the traditional economy. And I think about this in particular when you talk about women who are vulnerable populations and think about this Me Too era and how some of what I think are some of the most powerful stories have come out and are not necessarily about famous actresses, but about the women who felt like they truly had no ability and no power to come forward because losing this job would eliminate the little protection that they did have.
Right. Well, if you think about some of the questions around vulnerability to harassment or abuse in the workplace, this is a workplace where you're the only worker in the workplace, right? There's no HR department, there's no water cooler, there's not even another coworker to go to for support and to ask advice from. And there's this long history of exclusion from basic labor rights. If you think about it culturally, we don't even refer to this work as work. We call it help, right? And yet it's a full-time profession. It's a livelihood for millions and millions of workers and millions more. And in fact, because of the growing older population in this country, where the boomers are turning 70 at a rate of 10,000 people per day, 4 million people per year, and living longer than ever, home care is the fastest growing occupation in our entire economy, and the average wage is $15,000 per year. So the people we're counting on to take care of our families as our loved ones age can't take care of their own doing this work, on top of high degrees of vulnerability to abuses like sexual harassment, which ever since the Me Too movement went viral a couple of years ago, the conversation in every room where domestic workers and home care workers gather is those stories of harassment. It is like, finally, we're breaking the silence around that culture of violence. And I have to say that cities are places where we're actually able to start addressing that right now, today. To this day, there are no federal sexual harassment protections for workers in workplaces with 15 employees or less. That's effectively excluding the entire care industry, right? Where there's no federal protections from discrimination or harassment. Cities are the places where we've had the most success in addressing that. So the millions of people who fall through the cracks, cities like Seattle, cities like Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. are starting to move on how do we innovate ways to protect this workforce and support survivors who are coming forward. And in fact, the city of Seattle has been our greatest partner so far in thinking about how do we create new ways of bringing all the industry stakeholders together to be at one table, to actually, because this is a complex situation. This is not just about law and policy. This is about changing culture. Yep. There's a long-standing culture of devaluing care work, right? And invisibilizing the work that goes into caring for families. So bringing all the industry stakeholders together to think together about the future, what the standards should be, and how do we enforce those standards as families, as workers, as employers, everyone at one table. So in Seattle, we passed a standards board, a whole new model to really protect this workforce and establish standards. Philadelphia is considering, actually very soon, could be the next city to pass a domestic worker bill of rights that includes that kind of innovative structure. We're really excited about what's possible in Washington. And I just think it's like, if we think about if we're looking for signs of the future, you look to the margins, not just for the problems that are potentially the threats to potentially come in the future for everyone, but also the solutions. A lot of the most innovative ideas have been happening in the shadows, right? That can actually benefit millions of workers in the future, and cities are taking the lead.
I want to just add, I mean, there was a study that the Pew Research Center released a couple of years ago that said that there are apparently 45 million immigrants in America today, 45 million, 11 million of whom are undocumented. So I'm one of the 11 million undocumented people. There's 45 in total. In the next 50 years, according to Pew, 88% of the total US population growth is going to come from those 45 million immigrants, right? So that's why I think when Ajin was talking about this is the future, like, and again, how do cities, because cities, I think, benefit from this the most. And you asked this great question about protection. You know, at Define America, our job has been like, how do we change how people see what this issue is? And for us, media is a way to do that. I mean, one thing that Ajin and I really share in common is our belief that the role of changing culture, which means the role of television and movies, right? So Define American, for example, has consulted on more than 60 television shows and films that are trying to integrate immigrant storylines, many of them in the workforce, right? There was a study that we did with the Norman Lear Center at USC that said that whenever they see Latinx people on television, mostly they're seen as domestic workers, right? Or like in kind of considered low-skilled jobs. And again, even the language around this. I don't know about you, but I come from a family of farmers in the Philippines. There's nothing low-skilled about farming. You should try it. Right? Is there anything low?
Or caregiving.
Or caregiving. Is there anything low-skilled about that? And this, to me, is the kind of the cultural shift that needs to change in terms of clearly the laws that can happen city by city, but also the way we even talk about the people and what the issue even is.
Yeah. So you were saying that you've had this insane travel schedule. When you did the math, tell us how much you've been traveling.
So honestly, you know, I came out as undocumented 8 years ago when President Obama was in the White House. 2011, that was the year that President Obama deported 400,000 immigrants, and I was not one of them. I don't know why. So I started an organization called Define American. So how do we use, because mine's just one story, right? How do we use stories to really combat the anti-immigrant narrative that is like a virus that has spread so wide it elected a president, right? Let me just repeat that. The anti-immigrant narrative is a virus that has spread so wide it elected a president. And guess what? It's changing Europe, as we know it. Our travels at Define American has been, because look, I can't wait for DC to get its together, right? I don't know when DC is going to figure out how to do immigration reform, whatever that even is. And if activists, for example, now that I've been in this other world and seeing kind of how activists have been organizing people, I don't know if you told people that, oh yeah, we'll make you legal, we'll get you legal, but we can't let you be citizens. I don't know if you've heard some of these reports. Or, for example, I haven't seen my mom for 26 years, right? So she sent me here. She can't even come on a tourist visa because she's not a college graduate and she doesn't own property. That tells you a lot about how she's been waiting in line legally to come for 17 years, which is how long you wait if you're from the Philippines or India. Now, if the Trump administration gets their way, they want to cut legal migration from a family-based visa, which is how there's people like me here, because they want to make it all about merit, right? And my mom, I guess the only merit you could say is that she gave birth to me, and maybe that's not enough. So even thinking about kind of how so much of the language around this is isolated, like we isolate people from the undocumented people separate from the documented people, when in reality, the undocumented population, as Ajin knows, like we all live in the same households, right? And for us, like figuring out, again, like how, from where I'm coming from as a journalist and as a filmmaker, like storytelling is the only place that can hold all the complexity and the nuance around these issues. Politics will not do that. They're too busy trying to get elected and telling you what you need to hear, versus what the complexity and what the nuances are in this situation.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because the immigration narrative is so often an us and them narrative, and yet the industry with the largest concentration of undocumented immigrants in the country is domestic work. So these are the people, humans, who are raising our children walking with us through life, nurturing the human potential of the people we love the most, upholding the human dignity of the people who raised us, right? What could be more important? We're already so interdependent and interconnected. And the idea that we could somehow be torn apart, right, is actually not tenable. And when we do think about the growing aging population, many cities are grappling with a growing aging population of older people who want to age in place and in their homes and in their communities, right, which is different from previous generations. We're going to need a huge caregiving workforce to support a dignified quality of life for all of us, including older immigrants, right? And there's no way to do that without a really strong immigrant inclusive workforce. Immigrant, non-immigrant, all of us, young, old. It's an all hands on deck situation to care for American families in the future. And so even just looking at through the care lens alone, there is no way that it's an us and them situation.
I want to follow up on that for 1 second, because it ties back into, Jose, what you said about the idea that fear of immigrants and this narrative that has been created got a president elected. And how do you think that gap works of both people having people in their homes who are working and they consider part of their family, who are with them day to day, but then when they go to the polls, they are not thinking about those people? How does that happen, and then how do you change that, and will it be changed in time for the next presidential election?
Yes?
That's all yours.
I think that this is a question of narrative and culture and engagement. And I do believe in what Brian Stevenson talks about, which is proximity. And whether it's through story or whether through actual proximity, it does really make a difference. The way that immigration is framed as an issue, when people experience the people in their lives who are caring for them, it often feels like a separate thing from the way we talk about immigration.
Yes.
So we need people and stories to help make the connection between the two, so that people understand that when they're in the ballot box, when they're kind of voting, that this is what's at stake, right? These humans, these relationships, these people we know, right? I think that will make a huge difference.
So we were talking about travel. So ever since I came out and started Define American, so I've done 1,800 events in 49 states in 8 years. And I've tried as much as possible, like maybe a third of them in conservative Republican areas. I just wrote a book, and the freshmen at Louisiana State University were required to read the book over the summer. So my publisher was like, that's a lot of books, go over there. So I went to Baton Rouge in Louisiana and met with the 900 kids who had to read the book. And it was fascinating how they've grown up on Fox News their entire lives. So seeing like a non-Latino, English-speaking one was like, you seem like such a nice guy. I was like, well, what did you think? You know? Proximity, and this is why the role of media. Define American a few years ago partnered with MTV. We did a 1-hour special called White People, which was inspired by my traveling across the country. Whenever I talked about immigration in the South and the Midwest, the conversation at the end was always about race. And so I did this documentary for an hour. It premiered literally a month after Trump announced he was running for president. And part of the film, MTV did a study. I was surprised about this. 75% of white people live in predominantly white towns, and 90% of white people have predominantly white friends. And no amount of listening to Drake and Rihanna changes that, right? Like, so proximity to people like us, the only proximity a lot of white people have in places that are not urban areas are the television shows they watch, the films they see, right? The narrative that Fox News has built since I was in middle school, right? We are now living through the narrative consequences of the past 25 years. That's how Trump got elected. And I have to say, us in the mainstream media have also been a part of the challenge here. I remember when The Atlantic a few months ago had a cover story by David Frum that said, how much is too much immigration, right? And at Define American, we actually two of the themes that we really, from a storytelling perspective, promote is bondedness, what bonds us together, right? And abundance. So when people say, oh, there's too many of you, we're overpopulated. Have you been to Idaho? I have. It's not that overpopulated. I was in Boise just last week. We had Define America, we organized a meeting with the Dairymen Association. 85% of dairy workers in the state of Idaho are undocumented. And the Dairymen's Association are like, how can we get the red state of Idaho to realize that these people, we go to the, you know, the guy who's the head of this association was speaking, and I quoted, we were talking about this quote that, I have to find out who said this quote, but it's from Europe. We asked you for workers, you sent us people. So I said that in this meeting, and I said, you know, sir, we are more than your labor, right? Like, we're actually, like, we are people. And then he started talking about how, you know, how close the Dairymen Association were to the workers. They go to the quinceañeras, they go to the, so for me, let's lean in on that. Yeah. Let's lean in on like what actually you have together, and families, you have that in common, the Polish and the Swedish who helped make Idaho what it is. What does that make different from the Mexicans and the Guatemalans who are now making up your workforce? Mm-hmm. So that, for me, is a big part, I think, of the work, the engagement. I love that you said that, Aijen. I think engagement has to be a big part of this.
And I think cities have a huge role to play.
I was going to say, if we can talk about what you think are the core things that cities need to be paying attention to and the core things that cities need to be changing in order to serve this population better and to create better protections. And, as you said, to prepare for the future where more workers are going to be in what has traditionally been considered a marginalized area.
Yeah. I think cities can help social movements like my organization scale the best solutions. An example is we created a portable benefits platform, the first of its kind in the country, called ALIA. The URL is myalia.org. And it basically allows for domestic workers with multiple clients to get access to benefits for the very first time. So you can, every time you know, a domestic worker comes and cleans your home, you add a small contribution that goes into her benefits fund. She gets to decide which benefit she wants to apply the money in her fund towards, and it follows her. Cities can help us scale the adoption of platforms like ALIA, and it's accessible to anyone and everyone. And as soon as we get it to scale for domestic workers, we can bring it to any number of sectors and industries where workers have a hard time getting access to benefits because of the structure of their industry. So that's the kind of thing where there's so much opportunity when we actually lean in and think about what are the best ideas and how can cities utilize their platforms to help us grow them and make them the new normal. Yeah.
I've been thinking a lot of, you asked this a few minutes ago. I've been thinking a lot about, so if I as an undocumented person in this country, if I don't have rights from the federal government, who do I get it from? I just recently moved to Berkeley. I'm from the Bay Area, so I moved to the Republic of Berkeley. And so I'm in this really interesting conversation with the city about, well, wait a second. So I'm a property paying, you know, I pay taxes in the city of Berkeley, right? I live in Berkeley. I pay taxes every year, which the IRS is happy to take. But what exactly am I a part of here, right? Like, it's a relationship, right? Like, what is the relationship between the city and me? And again, I don't know what the federal government is going to do, but what I do know is, in many ways, the freedom of undocumented people and immigrant workers are going to rely on the cities and the municipalities, and what laws they're willing to pass that would make us feel more seen and more included and feel like we belong in our communities. Mm. So I think that, to me, is where we have to focus on. We can't focus too much on what's happening in DC, where nothing is happening, where we have to go, I think, city by city by city.
Yeah. Well, I could stay up here and talk about this all day, but I think we'll end there. Please join me in thanking Aijen and Vargas.